that are unchurched, you may want to introduce them to your church by saying, hey, take a look at it there. Or if some Sunday you are not able to be here, you have to take care of a sick relative, or you're working, or you have to stay home yourself for health reasons, well, you can pick it up there. We don't do it live stream, but we do it, release it at 2 o'clock and 2:15. So look for it there and direct people there. Direct people to our website too, because that's a good way to let somebody know that this church is involved in a lot of different things, and there would be a place for them here as well. You know, to keep you from error, and there's a lot of error out there. In our church, we have a thing called Second Look on Tuesday, 6 p.m. We meet. This week we met here. We're going to meet in here again this coming Tuesday, and it's a very different kind of way to study the Bible. I think Linda said it right one time. It's not a Bible study, it's a study of the Bible with an eye of keeping you free from error. We do on Thursday night, Ask Me Anything, a live stream on our YouTube channel and Facebook page as well, and answer all kinds of questions that will keep you from error. That's why we do these things. To keep you in the Word and strong every day. We post online, again, the Facebook page, our daily Bible reading calendar, so that day by day you can go through the Old Testament, New Testament twice, Proverbs 12 times, and Psalms twice in a year. And that's why we put it there, is so you can stay in the Word and stay strong. And to keep you close to God, we have times of prayer. We initiated, first time today, in our new prayer room. You may want to take a look at it before you leave. 9:45 pre-service prayer. Next week, we resume our 5 p.m. Sunday prayer. We've also got a prayer chain, and if you have needs, you can put those needs on that prayer chain. You can see Elaine Spalding about that. Or if you want to be one of the people that prays on the prayer chain. That's why we have those things, is to keep us close to God. And to keep us close to the things that are the heart of God. We encourage you to tithe. We encourage you to give to things like the mission in Bukemba, Kenya, and our other missions all around the world. That's why we do those things. And to make sure that we pay attention to the people that are Jesus' special friends, the hurting and the desperately poor. Once a month we serve a very fine meal to a group down the street, and we do that at Living Hope, and week by week we have Helping Hands food distribution from here. This last week, over 300 people were given healthy food. Why do we do that? Because Jesus says we've got to be involved in helping the hurting, because they're very close to His heart. I just bring those things up because some people in our church may hear us talk about some of these things, and it just goes in one ear and out the other, and you think, oh, well, Tuesday night Bible study, that's for somebody else. Prayer time, that's for somebody else. No, it's for you. And I would encourage you, if you at all possible, and believe me, I have been through the raising the kids years, and I know how valuable time can be. But if you can make time for any of those things, we do them for those reasons, and those are opportunities in our church, and I think there's some here that can take advantage of them that maybe you haven't yet, so I just bring it up. Some of you may be sorry that you came today when we get finished here in the next few moments, and I don't think we'll be long. But some of you may regret having come today, because I'm going to show you something that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it carries responsibility with it. God has no problem when we are ignorant of something. He doesn't hold us accountable for that. And in fact, in the Bible, Paul will say several times, I would not have you be ignorant. He puts no premium on ignorance. But if we are ignorant, and by that we simply don't know something, He doesn't hold us accountable for that. But once we know, and I'm going to show you something today that once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. And so, just be forewarned. I've had two spiritual crises, I guess you would call them, in my life. One of them occurred before I became a Jesus follower, and I've shared a little bit about it. I don't talk about it very often. But before I became a follower of Jesus, I had a real problem with what's in this book, most especially the gospel, the story of Jesus. This story that has a fairy tale-like quality to it. A king comes from another place, another land. He arrives as a baby. How unlikely is that? And then as he grows, he solves all of our problems. He kills all of our dragons. He dies for us. He rises again, and we all live happily ever after. I had a problem with that story because it sounded like a fairy tale to me. And it was one of those stories, and here was my problem, that was too good to be true. And if something is too good to be true, it's not true. That was my crisis. I couldn't believe it. I wanted to believe it. Maybe I didn't. I'm not sure. But I couldn't believe it because it was just too good to be true. I finally reached a point in my search, and I searched all kinds of places. I read all kinds of books and listened to all kinds of people, all kinds of different religions and psychologies and philosophies, and I tried to educate myself about how I should live, but I found all of those things very unsatisfying in one way or another. It's another story for another day, but I was reading the New Testament at the same time. I almost had to. But again, it was too good to be true. I remember picking up a book by a very bright person, somebody I admired, Bertrand Russell, naturalist, philosopher, mathematician, brain upon brain. We would not have the space program if it were not for Russell. But he was a naturalist philosopher, which meant that he didn't believe there is a God. The only reality is what you can see and taste and hear and be aware of here. And in effect, we are our own gods. I read a book by him. I picked it up because I was intrigued by the title, Why I Am Not a Christian. I liked the title because I knew why I wasn't a Christian. I was a Christian because I couldn't believe it, or maybe I didn't want to believe it. So I was interested to know why this smart man was not a Christian, why I am not a Christian. And as I read through that thing, I made notes and questions and underlines all through the thing. I guess I was in dialogue with him. I was arguing with him. And his explanations for why you shouldn't be a Christian didn't satisfy me. I thought there were holes in his argument, and I saw problems with what he said. And I set that book aside, very disappointed. I was hoping he would affirm my decision not to be a Christian. He didn't. About the same time, somebody gave me another book. I've told you about it before, The Search for the 12 Apostles, the story of what happens to all of Jesus' core followers when the New Testament closes. When the New Testament ends, Paul is in prison. We don't know what happens to him. We're not sure if he gets out and gets to make his long-wished trip to Spain and share the gospel there. We're not sure. Or does he get his head cut off? We're not sure. He's in a Roman prison. James, one of the original 12, has had his head cut off. But we don't know what happens about the rest. This is the story from Roman records of what happened to them, and they all died a horrible death, saying, we saw what we saw, Jesus rise from the dead. They couldn't get them to get off that story. I remember finishing that book, and it told the story of how one died in India, and one died in Spain, and one died in Italy, and one died in Africa. They died all over the place by a variety of means. That's not the important part. The important part was they died saying Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus rising from the dead is the core of this remarkable story that sounded too good to be true. Everything hinges on that. If he rose from the dead, it's true. If he didn't, it's not. And these people said, we saw him rise from the dead and we'll die for that. I remember finishing that and I thought to myself, they would have known. Of all the people that would have known, they would have known if this were a made-up story, faked. But they die saying, we saw it. That's pretty strong. But then I began to realize that they all died in isolation. Again, one in Rome, one in Africa, one in Syria, one in India. They died all over the place. All over the place. Which meant that the guy in India, when they're pointing the arrows at him and saying, tell us that it didn't really happen, he could have said, okay, we made it up. It was a joke. It was a hoax. We made it up. And he would have saved his dirty Dutch neck. But the guy in Rome would never have known that. They didn't have cell phones. He would never have known that he gave it up. But they didn't. They died in isolation. And when I realized that the story that's too good to be true is true. So the first crisis of faith that I've had two, was, is the story true? It's true. Now, some years later, I had my second crisis of faith. We were at Fairfax. And as I began to look around, it seemed to me that the church lost every battle it got involved in. And I didn't like that. I don't know about you, but I don't like to lose. I'll fight really hard not to lose. I'll fight really hard not to lose. I didn't like losing. And I realized that one of the reasons the church seemed to be losing is it's weak, it's powerless. It's not the powerful church that you read about in the book of Acts. And we lose because we have no power. And there is no power, it seemed to me, because people in the church didn't seem to be a whole lot different than people outside of it. They seem to have the same problems, deal with the same addictions. The divorce rate is the same. The problem rate is the same. Everything is the same. There seemed to be no life change. And I guessed that was the reason we're always on the losing end of this thing, is we're really no different. There's no life change. And I began to worry about that. Because by that time I was neck deep in this thing. It's what I do. And it looked like what I do wasn't working. And I began to worry about that, and I thought, you know what, buddy, maybe you better find something that works and get out of this, because this isn't working. About that time, I got a call from a friend I hadn't heard from in a long time. A missionary friend by the name of Leighton Jones. Leighton is a Bakersfield kid. In fact, he grew up just a few blocks from here, and I remember one time I helped him move his parents' piano out of the house and nearly lost my life for that thankless task. Leighton was working on a doctoral program, and he's one of the first persons I ever knew that used a computer, and his computer crashed. I remember that. I didn't know what it meant when computers crashed. I didn't know anything about it then. I don't know much about it now, but nothing then. He's been a friend for a long time, so I took his call, and he said, "Can you think about doing me a favor?" I said, "Well, tell me how big a favor." Because I was still thinking about the piano, and I figured he owed me. I didn't owe him. And he said, "Well, I've got a friend, an older friend," and he named him Jim Hall. I knew of Jim. I didn't know him. He was a name in the Assemblies of God many years ago. He and two or three others were kind of the young guys that were thinking big thoughts, innovative guys. He said, "Jim Hall is a friend of mine, and he was scheduled to do a seminar in Bakersfield at a large church, but they canceled on him. And it's too late for him to change his plans. He's already got his ticket, and it's not reversible. And so what I'm asking is, could you host him at your church, let him do a seminar, and could you get together a few pastors to hear what he has to say?" So I said, "Sure, I'll help." I didn't know the man. I didn't know what he was going to talk about. I just wanted to help Leighton, and so I said, "Sure, fine." And so I kept my end of the bargain and gathered together 10 or 12 pastor friends and on the date that he was going to be, and we hosted him in Freedom Hall at Fairfax. We were gathered around some tables, and Jim came in, and he began to talk. He introduced himself. He's an older fellow, a very reserved kind of guy, but very smart. And he began to talk in his very soft voice and greeted us and told us who he was and that he was raised on the mission field by missionary parents in Burkina Faso, Africa, that he'd spent a big part of his career at our great church in Singapore, a very multi-ethnic church. He'd been on staff there and done some of his work there. He said, "I want to talk to you today about Matthew 28, 18, 19, and 20. It's known as the Great Commission. That's what we call it. It's a very familiar passage. And as Jim said, I want to talk to you about Matthew 28, 18, 19, and 20. I have to confess that I very arrogantly thought within myself, I wouldn't dare say it out loud. I'm sure I had a nice face on. But inside, I was thinking rotten thoughts like, what are you going to tell me about Matthew 28, 18? I know Matthew 28, 18, 19, and 20. I've memorized it. I've done word studies on it. I know what the original words are, almost every one of those original words, and how they interact with each other. I've taught it. I've preached it. I've used it as the basis for missions conventions, missionary services. What are you going to tell me about Matthew 28, 18? Arrogant, huh? That's the way it was. But I was listening as Jim began to talk, and as we say it now, he began to unpack those verses. And I quickly realized that I didn't know anything about Matthew 28, 18. It begins, Jesus speaking, saying, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. And as he began to explain it, I began to think about what the rest of Scripture had to say on that. I guess I'd never really thought about it very deeply, but Scripture is very plain that at some point after the cross and resurrection of Christ, the formal announcement was made to the powers of darkness, hell, the devil, and all his cohorts, who had much power over the nations, who could make people sick, who could sway the thinking of leaders and do all kind of deals, cause all kind of chaos and harassment. Their power was taken away, and a formal announcement after the cross and resurrection was made to them. The book of Ephesians talks about it. And they were informed in no uncertain terms that though they had desired the crucifixion of Christ, a little bit of spiritual jujitsu had been played on them. That was the absolute worst that could have happened to them, because now all of their authority, all of their power had been taken away. And the devil has power today, but it's only the power to lie. The devil cannot make you do anything. He cannot force you into a situation. He cannot dictate to you. He can't make you have certain feelings. He can't read your mind. The only power that the enemy now has, the only power he was left with, is the power to deceive, and he's very good at it. But all he can do is lie. That's all. He can lie to you. That means that every ugly thing that ever happens, every time a woman is raped or a child is molested or there's genocide somewhere in the world, every crime, large or small, every harsh word, everything ugly that happens, every time it happens, what it means is the devil didn't make anybody do anything, but the devil told somebody something and they believed a lie. Do this and you'll feel better. Jim began to explain that's what it means when Jesus says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Heaven and earth, that's the whole shooting match. There is no power and authority outside of that. Jesus has got it all. That Great Commission goes on to say that since all authority has been given to him, he's going to ask us to do something. And we cannot fail because he will share all of that power and authority. He said, the thing I want you to do is go and make disciples. That's what it says in Matthew 28. Go and make disciples. That's a church word. Let me unpack that for you. It means followers. Go and make followers of Jesus. Not followers of a church, not followers of a leader, not followers of a personality, but make followers of Jesus. Jesus said, I've got all authority and all power, and you can go and do this. Make followers, he said. Followers like an apprentice. Now he's got my attention. He wants us to go and make apprentices. Is that it? I understand that. the apprenticeship process. If I'm an apprentice, I don't know anything. The master plumber knows everything. And it's his job to tell me which wrench to use on which fitting and how to turn it, which direction, how many times. I don't know anything. I learn everything from him. And I learn it not from a book, but he shows me. He shares with me from his life if I'm an apprentice. Jesus said, I want you to go and make apprentices of mine. And then he says, go to all nations. All nations. When the Bible talks about nations, it's not talking about geographical locations, France and Luxembourg and Spain and Saudi Arabia and borders. It's not talking about that when it talks about nations. It's talking about people groups. And however you can group people, that's a nation. A nation is an ethnicity, a nation, a people group, is a language group or a place of origin or your level of education. That can be a group of people. Or people that like snow skiing or fishing, or that can be a people group. In other words, it will work with all people everywhere. I have all authority. Make apprentices of all nations. And what are we to do? He said, teach them everything I've taught you. I began to think, what had Jesus just completed? When he's saying this is his swan song. This is one of the last things Jesus will say on earth before he leaves, before he exits the planet. He says, I want you to go and teach them everything I've taught you. What had he just done? Well, for 3.5 years, he'd taken a group of people, originally 12, but it got much bigger than that. And they had followed him, literally followed him everywhere he went. They saw who he saw and ate what he ate and slept where he slept. And they watched him as he healed. They watched him as he exorcised the demons. They watched him as he encouraged. They watched him as he taught people. They watched him as the crowds were absolutely astounded, amazed by his words, and said, we've never heard anybody speak like this. They were there, firsthand eyewitnesses. They had followed him. And then what had he done? He had sent the 12 out. You read that story in the Gospels. He shows them how to do things. He shows them the ropes. And then he says, now you go and you tell the story. Now you go and you deliver people from the devil. You go and you heal people. And they did. And when they returned, Jesus says, you know what? While you fellas were out there doing that, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Bravo. Score one for the home team. And after that, what did he do? He sent out 70 with the same mandate, and they did the same thing. They healed and they delivered and they fed and they taught. Just like Jesus did. Why? Because they followed him. And he taught them everything they knew. And then the day came when he left, and he left it on their shoulders. And they functioned just fine. Jesus says, I want you to go, and I want you to make apprentices, and I want you to teach them everything I've taught you. What in your walk with Christ has Jesus Christ shown you? Has he shown you how to pray? Has he shown you how to weather the storm? Has he shown you how to overcome temptation? Has he shown you how to forgive and be forgiven? Of course he has. That's what we're to teach others. And then Jesus says, and I'll be with you till the end of the age. In other words, you can't miss. If you will take my message and harness it, marry it to my method, which is to go and make an apprentice so effectively that that follower can make a follower who makes a follower, you can't miss, because I'm with you always. In other words, I'll be with you until the job is done. It's his guarantee. And when Jim finished explaining that, I must have had that deer in the headlights look, because he said something like, you've just had an aha moment. And I had. And I had realized that 30 years into ministry, I had missed the main thing. You see, my idea of discipling was new people come into the church and you have a class for 6 weeks and you show them the ropes and tell them how stuff goes and kind of how you run the church and what you believe and what's important. And then they graduate and boom, they're discipled. That's not what Jesus said. He said, you spend quality time with them. Do with them what I just did with you. And teach them everything I've taught you. Harness yourself with one other person and show them how to live for Jesus. Show them how to follow Jesus. And show them so effectively that they can't wait to show somebody else how to follow Jesus. And that is following Jesus. And until the person that you've led to Christ or you've shown how to follow Jesus, until they've shown somebody else how to follow Jesus, you cannot say that you follow Jesus, because that is following Jesus. Going to church by itself is not following Jesus. Tithing, as important as it is, by itself, not following Jesus. Serving as an usher or a teacher or helping to distribute food or at Living Hope or whatever, those are great things and necessary things, and we don't dare do without them. But following Jesus is making a follower of Jesus who makes a follower of Jesus. That's following Jesus. Amen. And I realized at that point that I had never known what following Jesus was. Well, since that time, we've set things in motion in our church, and we'll talk more about that in September. But I bring it up because that is following Jesus. That is the thing. That is the most important thing. I want you to take a look at a passage. Matthew 9, and I hope you brought your Bible with you or your Bible app. Matthew 9. Let me break it down for you so that it becomes a little more understandable. Doing what Jesus did, showing people how to follow Jesus. Matthew 9, verse 36, talking about Jesus and how he felt internally, emotionally. It says, seeing the people, he, Jesus, felt compassion. There was a huge group of people there. And some were confused, and some were rebellious, and some were hungry, and some were angry, and some were sick, and some needed healing. They were all in some state of brokenness. And it says, seeing the people, he felt compassion for them. Why? Spirited like sheep without a shepherd. Sheep without a shepherd are very vulnerable. They can't survive on their own. They don't have the natural qualities to be able to do that. And they'll be a prey to just about everything else. Plus they'll get lost and get hurt. So Jesus paints this picture. He says he looks on the crowd and he feels compassion because why? Because they're distressed and they're dispirited. They're like vulnerable sheep without a shepherd. When Jesus looked into that crowd, he didn't see a faceless crowd. We've got to recognize how God sees people. How did Jesus see people? He didn't see a faceless crowd. He saw individuals with severe problems. That's what touched his heart. He didn't see a mob of people. He saw individual men, women, mothers, fathers that had severe problems, everyone. His heart went out to them, but not a faceless crowd to Jesus. And he realized as he looked on that crowd of individuals with severe problems that every one of their problems, and their problems run the gamut. There were people dealing with addiction. There were people dealing with lust and pride. There were people that had anger issues. There were people that were poor. There were people that were broken. There were people that were deformed. There were people that were sick. There were people with all kinds of problems and maladies. But all of the problems were from one cause. What does it say? They were dispirited like sheep without a shepherd. Their one cause, no matter what the problem was, they were separated from their shepherd. That's the way you've got to see people. All of the severe problems, and there can be many. And we can't solve all those problems. I tell the crew that goes to Living Hope, we can't solve all of these problems tonight. We can do a little bit to alleviate their suffering. We can't solve everybody's problem. There are too many and they're too severe. But they're all from one cause. Everybody's problem is because they're separated from their shepherd. And they're in danger and they're vulnerable. Those that are Spanish speakers here today, you have a leg up. When I say the word pastor, you know what I mean, shepherd. That's the job of a pastor, is to protect first and foremost. I can be the world's greatest speaker or the greatest administrator or a whiz-bang of a counselor. Believe me, I'm not. If you come to see me, I'm nice and I'm polite the first time or two. But after that, it's like, oh, just quit whining, please. Just grow up. I don't have a lot. But even if I were the world's greatest counselor, I'd be a failure as a pastor if I didn't protect people. That's what shepherds do. They protect. And that's what Jesus does. And when he looks on the crowd with all their severe problems, the main cause, the root cause, is because they're separated from their shepherd. You've got to see people the way Jesus sees people. He sees people as separated from the shepherd. And then you've got to recognize how he feels about people. Everybody knows the most famous verse in all the world, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Not God hated the world. The Word doesn't know anything about this wrathful God that everybody seems so sure is out there. He so loved the world that he gave his own son. And to God, the way he feels about people is, to him, every citizen of the world is a child that's run away from home. That's the way he sees everybody that's without a shepherd. I've never had a child run away from home. Not really. Oh, they would get mad, because we made them eat something they didn't like, and they'd pack a bag and threaten, but they never did it. I can't imagine the horror of not knowing where your child was at night. Runaway. Vulnerable. And that's the way God feels about everybody without him. They're runaways that need to be brought back home, and he longs for each one of them to return because they bear his stamp, his image, their family. So you've got to recognize how God sees people. He sees people as having all kind of severe problems, but their cause is they're separated. You've got to recognize how God feels about people. He loves people and they're runaways. And then you've got to know what God is doing for his people. If you're going to be somebody who will do what the Great Commission says we should do, we should make followers of Jesus. We should spend time with somebody else and show them how to do this thing. That is following Jesus. Then you've also got to know what God is doing for his people, and then you've got to join him. What's he doing? Well, the very next verse, 9:37 of Matthew, Jesus looks up and he says, the harvest is plentiful. The harvest is plentiful. In other words, there are plenty of lost people out there that if somebody would just talk to them and love them and spend time with them, they wouldn't be runaways anymore. The harvest is plentiful. People just waiting to be asked and waiting to be invited. What is God doing for his people? He says the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Unfortunately, the cooperation level is very low. The number of people that will make followers who make followers is very few. There are lots of people that will go to church. There are lots of people that will go to worship nights. There are lots of people that will give. There are lots of people that will serve, but there are very few people. The cooperation level is low for those that will go into the harvest and spend time with one of those runaways. Unfortunately, the cooperation level is low, and what that means is God's efforts to reclaim those runaways is limited by the number of laborers that actively assist him. But here's the good news. God's Word and God's Spirit are given to those that will help him love others, that will help him disciple, that will help him make followers. That's what God's doing for his people. Then you've got to hear what God is saying to us, his people. Verse 38 of that same passage, he says, since the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few, And Jesus makes his one and only prayer request. He says, therefore, pray the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest. We've got to come along and we've got to pray with him. And we've got to focus on this labor shortage, because that's God's first focus, is the labor shortage. That's what we've got to do. I want to wrap this up. There's a very interesting verse. John 20:21. If we will be involved in the program of God, which is making followers who make followers who make followers. And that is a call that goes out to every believer, not just to specialists, not just to those of us that are more outgoing, not to those that are natural teachers. Jesus says every one of us should be a disciple maker. Every one of us should be spending time actively helping somebody else know how to follow Jesus. Helping somebody know how to pray and know what it is to overcome temptation, and how to read their Bible, and how to worship, and what it means when you come to the Lord's Supper, and why you should be baptized, and why Spirit baptism is important, and all of the things that go into following Jesus, all of the things that he's taught you. You need to pass on to somebody else actively. Every one of us, not just specialists. That's what we're to be about. But if we will do that, we are in a line of succession. We have the opportunity to be in a chain of cooperation that begins in the heart of the Father. Look at what John 20:21 says, and we'll wrap up with this. Jesus talking. And he tells us, as the Father has sent me, Jesus has been sent by the Father. That's why he came, in obedience to the Father, out of love to the Father. There's a broken world down there. It's full of runaways. What are we going to do? Will you go? And Jesus says, I'll go. What do you want me to do? I need you to die for them. I'll do it. He's been sent by the Father. What that means is it's the heart of the Father that sends Jesus. As the Father has sent me, that word sent is the same word we get our word apostle from. The apostles were sent people. To be an apostle means you have been sent. That's the Greek word, apostolion. You're sent. As the Father has sent me, it's an apostolic word. But the Latin equivalent, you know it, missio, mission. That's why this is called the Great Commission. We are on a co-mission with Jesus. I'm on Jesus' mission with him. That's what this is all about. And the mission is that I would make followers. How? Like he made followers. By spending time with them. As the Father has sent me, Jesus says, I'm on a mission. He's talking about the missionary heart of the Father that sends. As the Father has sent me, I'm sending you. You're in that unbroken chain that starts in the heart of the Father. If you will obey the Great Commission, Matthew 28:18, if you will obey it, it starts in the heart of the Father, the missionary heart of the Father, the sending heart of the Father that he transfers to the Son, and the Son transfers that heart to you. That's the greatest work in all the world. That is following Jesus. As the Father has sent me, I'm sending you. And now you know. And you can't unknow. And when the Bible says all authority has been given to me, go into all the world, and I'll be with you to the end of the age, it's not just a nice, warm, fuzzy verse anymore. You know. That's what we're to do. Each and every one of us should be investing ourselves in that. As I said, in September, we'll talk more. We'll put meat on these bones, and I'll show you how you can actively do that. There are people in our church that have done it, and some still are doing it. It changes lives. It transforms people. It changes people. No longer do we have followers of Jesus that are up and down and in and out. But you're following hard after Jesus. And following Jesus means you're making a follower who makes a follower. That is following Jesus. And now you know. That's what following Jesus is. You can't unknow that now. You're responsible for it now. And it can't just be a nice verse anymore. I've told you before, I think I mentioned it last week, that since February of 1978, I've used this little book, My Utmost for His Highest. It's a daily devotional. And every day I've nearly looked into it, and it's shaped my life. I work ahead at this point, and the one for today I read the other day. He's talking about not quenching the Spirit, but listen to what he says. And I only bring this up because you've heard some of this before. But he says, suppose God has brought you up to a crisis, and you nearly go through, but not quite. He will engineer that crisis again. Suppose God brings you to an insight like this, but you don't go through with it. You don't become a follower who makes a follower. What will He do? He will engineer it again. But listen, but it will not be so keen as it was before. There will be less discernment of God and more humiliation at not having obeyed. That's a fact, friend. As followers of Jesus, if He brings us to a point where He wants us to change something or do something or alter something, whether it's a habit to drop or something new to start, and we say no, we come up to it and we say no, He'll bring us back again. We'll go round that mountain again. But the next time it has less force and more shame. But look at what He says eventually will happen. There will be less discernment of God and more humiliation at not having obeyed. And if you go on grieving the Spirit, for that's what it is, once you know something and you don't do it, if you go on grieving the Spirit, there will come a time when that crisis cannot be repeated and you have grieved Him away. He'll leave you alone, but you've broken the heart of God. And now you know. Following Jesus is making a follower of Jesus. And don't feel bad if that hits you like a thunderclap, because I managed to be involved in this thing for 30 years and not know it. I missed the main thing. I want us to stand together. And I want you to close your eyes, because it's nobody's business but your own. I'm not looking. I don't want anybody to look. But I feel like we must make some kind of response today. Again, what we've talked about you can't unsee. And now you know. We've got to respond in some form or fashion.